Yongary is not a good movie. It is still heavily flawed, and not just for its visual effects. But recently, I have a new appreciation for the film. After listening to the audio commentary with Steve Ryfle and Kim Sun-ho, one of Korea's most prominent classic film historians, which is really informative, and I highly recommend it to any kaiju fan out there that you listen to this audio commentary. To make it clear, I don't really like Yongary Monster from the Deep. It's not, as I said earlier, a very good movie. In fact, Gorizard, David Joshua Hernandez, and I did a full feature-length commentary for the film on my show, Creature Feature Double Feature, in Season 1. And we go into great detail there if you want to listen to two people ramble on about their thoughts of the film. What makes Yongary Monster from the Deep, the original film, more than just a Godzilla knockoff is when you look at the making of the movie itself. When you look at where, when, and how it was made. And after listening to that audio commentary, only then did I really start looking at this film in a new light. And I do say I enjoyed this film a lot more as a result. Because I used to look at it as just a standard Godzilla ripoff, like Gamera, the giant monster Gamera, which is a Godzilla ripoff, and in many ways so is this. And now I see it as far more as an impoverished country, South Korea, trying hard to reach out to foreign audiences, really for the first time in this country's history. If anything, the movie is much more influenced by the Gamera films, not just because of the suit makers being the ones who worked on the Gamera films. This movie has a child at the forefront, where people could even say he is the true protagonist of the film, this kid, Incho, as he's called in the dub. It is light-hearted and a gory kaiju film, especially death scene. Anus bleeding. That's not very pretty. The design was also much more in line with the Gamera films than the Ishiro Honda Godzilla films. In fact, Masao Yagi was the designer, so it's no surprise. Masao Yagi worked on all the Gamera suits. It has a laser that shoots from its horn, like the laser from Gauss, a horn that glows, like in Barugon, from Gamera vs. Barugon. It breathes and eats fire, like Gamera, and the list goes on and on. The film was also directed by Kim Ki-duk, who is considered the genre man of Korea. He made movies for audiences to watch. One of, if not the most successful South Korean directors for a very, very long time. He was known for making blockbuster after blockbuster, including Yongary. Now, for the record, anything in Korea at the time that sold over 100,000 tickets was considered a huge success. To give you just how small the market was back then. And he was really, really good at finding trends in his country and making a movie about it. And this one just happened to be about a giant monster flick. He made films like musicals, teenage angst films like Rebel Without a Cause was a huge inspiration, apparently. And the giant monster genre was something that he just simply wanted to do. He was largely responsible for the youth generation becoming involved with seeing films in South Korea, often focusing on teenagers, a movement that exploded in the early, in every country around the mid-1950s and 60s, from the United States to England to Russia to even Japan. The composer for the film was also the most famous film composer in Korea at the time. The writer wrote countless of successful South Korean films that were popular in post-war South Korea. And it was produced by Kyung Ka-jin. I am brutally mispronouncing those names. Which he was responsible for bringing CinemaScope to South Korea. The people who worked... What I'm saying here is that the people who worked on this movie were not small people. They might be small people in the outer rings of Korea. Like, for example, they would be very small fish in a big pond. But in Korea, they were big fish in a very little pond. People in South Korea, in other words, knew their names, and making Yongary was an extremely prestigious project for the impoverished country to make. Because let's face it, especially it only being a decade after the devastating Korean War, which left the nation broken in two between North and South, the fact that this film was made was a huge undertaking for the country and for these filmmakers. Making this film was a large risk. For several reasons, but there's two big ones. One, it would be extremely expensive. This film actually killed Kim Ki-duk's production company because, despite of Yongary being a major success in Korea, being the highest grossing film in Korea in 1967, the production costs were far too high, and Kim Ki-duk retired from directing 2 years later as a minor response to the failure of Yongary. But they saw this as a chance to make international recognition for Korean cinema. This was made the year all 5 of Japan's major film companies released a kaiju flick. Let's make that clear, 1967. With Toho, we had Son of Godzilla and King Kong Escapes. Nakatsu, we had Gappa, the Triphibian Monster. Pretty good film, in my opinion. Daiei, we had Gamera vs. Gauss, a silly and dumb film, but still fun nonetheless. Shoshiku, we had the prestigious X from Outer Space. And Toei was helping out producing Yongary and releasing Giant Robo on television. And on top of that, Yongary was also being made in CinemaScope, new to Korea, and in Technicolor. Not new to Korea, but new with this widescreen process with anamorphic lenses. And the other reason that this was risky to do in Korea is it required them to work with the Japanese. Again, bringing up Masao Yagi's crew, who broke off from Tsuburaya in the 1960s to work on their own, and they wound up working with Daiei on the Gamera franchise, and many others. The Koreans and the Japanese don't like each other very much, and to be honest, I completely understand why, because the Japanese treated the Koreans like garbage. In fact, it's even considered a quote-unquote holiday, a national day of shame in South Korea, the day where Korea was annexed to Japan. To this day. And a lot of Korean critics at the time saw Yongary as Korean films being influenced by Japan just like they were back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Bringing back a lot of painful, rightfully painful memories from back then where they would be forced to watch these propaganda movies. Korea was essentially at this time having an identity crisis. The government, a military dictatorship for all intents and purposes, ordered the destruction of many Japanese buildings for simply resembling a Japanese building. Which is why there's actually a scene where Yongary specifically tramples a building that looks just like the Japanese government building, the Diet Building. And apparently, when this played in theaters, people cheered during that scene. I always found that interesting. Even when I was a kid, I always thought that scene looked like that part from the original Godzilla where he destroys the Diet Building. That was made for a big... that was definitely made for a reason. So making a production with the Japanese backing was extremely risky. It's the equivalent of an American-Soviet Union co-production in essence on a much smaller scale. Yet to combat this, the film depicts, in essence, Korea for Korea. Because in many ways, Yongary, the more you look at it, and the more you look at the subtext of the time period it was made, is a very nationalistic film, very similar to even something like Shin Godzilla, if you really look at the history behind it. Having a space station, which Korea would actually not be able to even launch a satellite until 2013, they are not taking part in... They here are not only taking part in the space race, but they're also taking part in world surveillance, giving Korea a sense of having more power than they really did at the time, and still kind of don't really have. It also follows 2 wealthy families who drive in expensive cars and live in high-end Western-style houses compared to the people running around them, pushing carts and wearing traditional Korean clothing. This was also a chance to show Korea as being able to defend themselves in the case of an attack from the north. Now, let me make it clear, this was made only 10 years after the conclusion of the bloody and devastating, especially to Korea, Korean War that left the country broken in 2, as I've stated earlier. In Yongary, there are no Americans or Westerners in the film at all. America had a huge presence in South Korea at the time, as they rightfully needed to, and we still do. There is no doubt in my mind, knowing the history of the Korean War and how much of a bloodbath that was and how it devastated the country, that South Korea at the time would not be able to do anything to combat something as large as Yongary without the help of the United States. But yet the film deliberately never shows that intervention. Those are Koreans that are arming those tanks. Those are Korean missiles firing at Yongary. It's Koreans that figure out the weapon that kills Yongary. Which Yongary is, in many ways, a representation of the North. which I just made a video on my Godzilla vlogs railing against how I don't like allegory. But the reason why I'm bringing this up here is because there's a lot of sources to back it. I'm not saying he's a complete representation of the North Korea. I'm just saying that what happens is very representative of the times. I mean, let's look at it. A great threat that comes from a city in the border where the Korean War began and heads south. Pyeongmuijin, butchering that name again, I'm sorry, is the city the Korean War really began, and that is exactly where Yongary first appears. And this isn't just me doing some over-the-top conjecturing, but repeatedly this is brought up by both Steve Ryfle, Kim Sung-ho, and even alluded to in the original Korean screenplay for the film. The director also thought it would attract foreign audiences, having Yongary act like a physical manifestation of North Korea, or the war itself, especially since that war had only ended less than a decade earlier. And also having people running away from Yongary, evacuating from cities, brought back countless of memories of the Korean War itself, of people running, cities being trampled by the kaiju, and lots more. Something extremely similar to the images of the original 1954 Godzilla. Both also took place about 10 years after the end of a devastating war for both Japan and Korea. In other words, I think the creators of Yongary understood the power of Godzilla and tried desperately to carry this over to Yongary, seeing it as a way of showing off something without actually showing it off. That's one of the great things about the science fiction genre, is you can do that without actually showing it off. And Twilight Zone and Star Trek, I can go off on those all day. Apparently, there was also, like how Japan is now, though in different reasons, a major crisis of masculinity in Korea back then. A lot of this stemmed from being conquered by Japan, not standing up for themselves and being able to free themselves. And now America has stepped in, having to do just about everything for them because of China, Russia, and North Korea. It's been like an Asian Poland. This is conjecture because it is brought up in the audio commentary, but they never really dive into why masculinity was such a crisis in Korea at the time, which is why I brought up what was there earlier. It was just conjecture. But that's just me kind of adding the dots together. I could be completely wrong. This movie has 3 men, here's the key, here's the masculinity part, has 3 men save the day. The astronaut, the scientist, and the boy. They step up and save the country from the wrath of Yongary. The astronaut sees what awakens Yongary. The scientist creates the serum-powder that kills Yongary, and the boy discovers what Yongary's weakness really is. Even though he also reawakens the monster, laughs when he's being killed, and then cries, "No, stop, not anymore." It makes no sense. The film also has a lot of special effects for such a small budget of a film, which, by the way, this budget for this film was not small for Korea at all. It was the largest budget Korean film for a very long time. Most was spent on bringing the Japanese crew over to shoot the effects sequences. They were taken aback by how small and just run down these studios were, the Japanese crew, but had to work with it. And the Japanese crew saw this as an opportunity to try to mend the wounds between Korea and Japan and gladly agreed to do the effects. And admittedly, the effects, when you watch the movie in its proper scope, though extremely clunky, are still pretty impressive to see in terms of scale. And I'm not afraid to admit that. There is a lot of things I can bring up in this video because of how, but I can't because of how long it would take. I'm not saying to make it clear that I like this movie. It's still enjoyably bad and ludicrous to sit through. But I truly recommend you listen to the in-depth audio commentary for this film that discusses the history of South Korean film, its rebirth in the mid-1950s, the state of the country, who the director is, and much, much more. It's one of the greatest audio commentaries I've ever listened to. If you listen to it, I'm not kidding, it might make you look at this film a bit differently, and perhaps appreciate the film a bit more. Or, in the least, see it as something more than just a Godzilla knockoff. Like and Productions on Facebook for all up-to-date information of what we're doing there. Join Geeks for Geeks, our group, for all the insanity there on Monster Appreciation Mondays. Follow me on Twitter, and Productions on Twitter. And in the end, this is Adam Noyce of Productions saying, sayonara.